well, I grew up non-denominational and I believed all these things. And then I went to graduate school and then I learned and then we deconstructed the Bible. And I realized that it's part of patriarchal supremacy and that really it's this Christianity is this hegemonic force that's oppressing us. And she was responding to a Christian who said that basically was criticizing her continual criticisms of the church. And she was arguing, well, we have to, because this is the how we liberate people, how we liberate women from again this patriarchal dominating force. And it's exactly what you just said. And of course it's a woman who goes to graduate school and all of a sudden now she's enlightened about how you deconstruct Christianity and liberate.
Yeah, but I mean, she's just being brainwashed in the same woke grad school stuff of CRT and all the crap that everybody else who's been to grad school has been exposed to. And so let's see, where was this? What was it? Okay, so then it says, next, after you wrestle with your privileges, you must release yourself from what you've begun to realize is not God himself. Deconstructing your faith can be a messy and complicated process, very similar to renovating a house. It can involve removing, adding, modifying, and rearranging the various structural elements that make up your belief and your lifestyle and your worldview to make it more livable. Thus, deconstructing your faith is not abandoning your faith wholesale, but rather looking for a more coherent and consistent way without inventing a new religion wholesale. So in other words, it's sort of like they're offering like, look, you don't have to totally abandon Christianity. Just get rid of all the things that are, goes against the modern world, like being opposed to Skittles stuff, right? Exactly. So that's all that it is, right? So yeah, call yourself a Christian and just scale it down to, not talking about Jesus being the only way to heaven. Kind of like Pope Francis the other day, right? All the religions are paths to God. Deconstructionism is a relatively new idea that originated in textual criticism. So this is, again, making my point. It's not just the deconstructionists and the postmodernist philosophers. It actually goes back to the post-Luther movements of higher textual criticism, deconstructing these texts down to, well, we don't really know what Jesus taught, and we don't really know who the authors of these Gospels are. And so, if you remember, there used to be this thing called the Jesus Quest. And this was this, globalist promoted thing of scholars who are a bunch of Skittles people, shocker, right, who decided that we only know about 2 to 3% of what Jesus actually said. The rest of what's in the Gospels are these accretions of traditions. So where do we get this idea that there's these accretions of traditions? Well, it sounds a lot like the Protestants, doesn't it? Yeah. So in other words, it's the same idea of Protestantism. And you'll notice that a lot of the deconstructionists in the Christian world, they keep linking themselves to Luther. They're like, we're just the next phase of Luther's deconstructing and getting rid of the traditions of men and the accretions. How often do you hear evangelicals say, I don't follow traditions of men, I follow the Bible and Jesus' word, and you believe in the traditions of men and your idols and your icons. This is just the next level of that by assuming that higher criticism can now be applied to every aspect of your own life. In other words, higher criticism was in academia, as Cotel said. This is doing deconstructing and higher criticism in your own personal walk in life to say, you don't know what these words mean. You don't know what the original Jesus was. Nobody knows what the original Jesus taught, if he even existed, right?
Right. Well, and Dan McClellan rejects a historical Christ.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. I mean, does he say why? Is it like...
he just says that we have no historical evidence for his existence. And then he makes the caveat, we don't have the historical evidence for a lot of people that existed at the time. And therefore, the only thing we can base it on is references in the New Testament, basically. That was one of the videos I watched.
Okay, did Joseph Smith not... I thought Joseph Smith was a prophet from God. Did he not know this wisdom that McClellan has, that there's no evidence for Jesus Christ?
Good question.
I mean, if that's true, that would mean that Joseph Smith was a false prophet, because Joseph Smith didn't tell us that Jesus didn't exist. We don't have any evidence.
Well, Mormonism is the first world religion to join the World Transhumanist Association. And
I remember you saying that. I did not. Yeah, that was fascinating. Yeah.
Lincoln Cannon is the head of the Mormon Transhumanist Association, the MTA, and he makes the argument that one doesn't have to be a Mormon to be a transhumanist, but to be a Mormon is to be a transhumanist, whether explicitly or implicitly. And they're part of this very liberalizing transhuman morphological freedom movement within Mormonism. And of course, Mormonism just condoned same-sex marriage. Was that like 3 or 4 years ago? So now it's okay within the Church of Latter-day Saints. So I suspect that Dan is part of the same, like, liberalizing all
Yeah.
these Mormons that have academic degrees.
Yeah, and they're probably
modernizing.
the Mormons that are now pro Skittles.
Right.
We've seen that emerge in the last 20 or so years, where the Mormon Church has shifted away from their anti-Skittles stance. Interestingly.
Yep.
Now, again, a lot of the articles that you'll see when you read about this, that pop up, they really like this house analogy, which is interesting because we kind of agree with that from a presuppositional, tag perspective. Like, yeah, you have these foundational beliefs, and then the rest of your beliefs are kind of built on those, presuppositions, those foundations that you have that make up your worldview. But what they'll always say in these articles and these explanations is, to deconstruct is actually a process that can be different, but it is taking apart every idea, practice, tradition, and belief into smaller components. So you basically break everything down into these parts, and then you try to figure out, how do you know that little part is true? How do you know this little part's true? And so it's like an evil version of what we do when we presup people, right? Where we're actually getting them to question their presuppositions. The difference is that this is like atheist presup, where they're trying to like get people to become atheists, right? Because they say, oh, it's a painful process, but you may have to do this because you don't really know. And now here's another thing I wanted to come to, which is this is actually a fallacy. I've noticed in a lot of these people, when they describe their journey, they commit the genetic fallacy. They will think that when they deconstruct and they get to this point where it's like, well, I just realized, like, I got that from my mom. Like, my mom raised me with this. Well, first of all, that it came from your mom is just the origin of the belief. That has nothing to do with whether it's true or false.
Right.
But they'll oftentimes make this leap, which is the genetic fallacy, to say that, I mean, why should I believe something just because my mom said it? Well, that's true, and it's okay to ask that question. But also, it's not false just because your mom said it. In fact, the fact that your mom said it has nothing to do with whether it's true or false. And so there's a lot of genetic fallacy going on with a lot of these people.
Well, and I would say authoritative fallacy too, fallacy of authority, because Dan constantly refers that what he's presenting as the state of religious scholarship.
Right? So he's just
on behalf of the academy. So if you have problems with him, then you have problems with contemporary biblical scholarship. And one of the academic criticisms, I mean, because deconstructionism, we've talked, there's plenty of critics also within the academy. And one of the points I wrote down that is fairly prominent is that it's overly deconstructive to the point that it's not constructive at all. As the point that you're making, it just breaks things down smaller and smaller and smaller. And so academic critics have highlighted that its primary focus of exposing contradictions and gaps and tensions within texts without providing any sort of constructive alternative response has led people to describe deconstructionism as nihilistic.
It's nihilistic,
offering little in terms of positive or meaningful engagement with any text, especially scriptural textual scholarship. So to your point, it's just constantly breaking things down into smaller and smaller bits. And of course, because it's ultimately relativistic, that's all you're left with.
Yeah. Why isn't McClellan, for example, deconstructing academia as a system of oppression and power, which has promoted what it's paid to promote? So I can turn the tables and use this very same argument, which I actually would do. And I would actually say that there's actually an agenda and a reason why the scholarship that you're appealing to in this fallacy of authority is promoted in academia. And that's because academia is corrupt. Which, by the way, he believes that academia in prior generations was corrupt because it promoted the patriarchal, phallocentric narratives. Oh, but now it's not corrupt, and we're supposed to just default to these people as if they're not corrupt anymore, when they're actually way more corrupt because they push the most ridiculous, even just totally degenerate stuff from academia. They're the spearhead. They're the tip of the spear of all of this revolution against, what is just common decency. Now, this article that I'm looking at here from the Sophia Society about deconstructing your faith, it actually goes on to describe, again, the breaking down of your paradigm, which is the stuff that we talk about. And it says that as you get older, you will realize that you encounter situations in life that don't fit with this paradigm. Now, that's actually true, I think, for evangelicals, right? Evangelicalism, as you said, is an anti-intellectual movement from the outset. And so it doesn't really equip people to handle really complex, nuanced situations. For example, evangelicalism can't tell you anything about geopolitics. They're usually totally ignorant about that. So when they're confronted with geopolitical issues like war, mass immigration, borders, they don't have any coherent answer to that because it's an anti-intellectual, ahistorical, scaled down, lowest common denominator position, oftentimes based on emotionalism. I converted in a big tent revival because I was crying and the preacher made me feel bad, and so it's a pseudo Christianity that causes people to get angry and doesn't have any grounding or any coherent worldview, and that's why these people are so easily led out of this religion. Is that a pattern you've noticed?
Well, you mentioned the ahistorical dimension of evangelical Christianity, and I think when you're speaking, what kind of popped in my head is that's another connector with what deconstructionism is doing, because it's constantly trying to undermine tradition, because history itself is plagued with injustices and all these different things that they're trying to correct. So deconstructionism is, I mean, really part of these critical scholarship or Marxist theories about paving a new beginning point in history, right? So it has to undermine and flatten everything that came before it. And evangelical Christianity is sort of ahistorical, and so it's able to sort of bridge that gap even quicker because it doesn't have any long-standing tradition to uphold.
Keep in mind, tradition is a key area of war for these people. That's just showing that they're the next logical revolutionary extension of Protestantism. Protestantism was all about deconstructing the Catholicism of that day to get rid of the accretions of tradition of the papacy, some of which are actually legitimate criticisms, but from an Orthodox perspective, we would disagree with both. But again, keep in mind the idea here is, I got to get rid of the man-made traditions. Well, the assumption then is that, well, how do you know there's not man-made traditions in this book that men decided to put together? Oh, I guess there could be, couldn't there? So now I have to scale down all of those things, and even in my own life, wait a minute, how do I know I'm not believing in man-made traditions? You may be. So it's this scaling down process of lowest common denominator, which Protestantism was built on. Ecumenism is also built on the same idea that it's not a holistic thing. Everything is piecemeal, broken down. It's all based on independent little data points that don't connect in any holistic, meaningful way. So there's a necessary anti-holistic perspective that undergirds all this as well.